There's a profound difference between knowing what you need to do and having the nervous system that actually wants to do it. Discipline is not just about willpower. It's about neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to adapt to hard things, to make the uncomfortable feel rewarding. And yes, this can be trained. When you repeatedly choose challenge over comfort, your brain begins to associate effort with progress. And that matters because the chemical dopamine, the molecule of motivation, isn't just released when you achieve something. It's released when you pursue something meaningful, especially in the face of resistance. Discipline is built through neuroplasticity, not willpower. This statement reframes a widespread misunderstanding about human behavior. Many believe that successful people are simply born with more willpower or that they possess some innate ability to push through discomfort. But science reveals something far more empowering. Discipline is not a trait you either have or don't have. It's a trainable function of the brain. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its structure and function based on experience. This is the foundation of all learning and habit formation. When we repeatedly perform a behavior, especially under emotionally charged or high-focus conditions, neural pathways are strengthened. Over time, those behaviors become easier to initiate and maintain, not because of motivation or inspiration, but because the brain has adapted to make them more efficient. Discipline then is the result of applying this mechanism deliberately over time. To understand how this works, we need to look at the circuits involved in behavioral control. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, planning, and impulse control, plays a key role. When you're faced with a decision between immediate gratification and long-term reward, it's this area of the brain that helps you suppress the urge for comfort and choose what serves your higher goals. However, the prefrontal cortex doesn't operate in isolation. It communicates with subcortical structures like the basal ganglia, which govern routine behaviors and habit loops. The more often the prefrontal cortex initiates a hard choice, like getting up early to train or turning down a distraction, the more the basal ganglia begin to encode that pattern as a default response. This is where repetition comes in. Repeated exposure to effortful tasks reinforces neural connections between motivation, focus, and action. At first, the decision to act with discipline requires conscious override, a sort of mental resistance training. But over time, that resistance weakens. The behavior starts to feel less effortful, your threshold for discomfort rises, and the neural pathways involved in effort-based decision-making become more accessible. That's not willpower, that's neuroplasticity at work. Another key player is dopamine, often misunderstood as the pleasure molecule. In reality, dopamine is more about motivation and drive. When you pursue something meaningful, especially something that requires struggle, your brain releases dopamine not just at the finish line, but during the process itself. That dopamine acts as a signal that says, this effort is valuable. Keep going. By linking dopamine to the grind rather than the outcome, the brain starts to treat the process itself as a source of reward. This is how discipline becomes sustainable through repeated action, reinforced by neurochemical feedback that tells the brain the hard path is the right one. Sleep, nutrition, and physical movement also modulate your brain's ability to rewire. For example, deep sleep, particularly slow wave sleep, is critical for consolidating neural changes. If you're training your brain to become more disciplined, recovery becomes part of the learning process. The same applies to nutrition. Certain amino acids and micronutrients are necessary for dopamine synthesis and synaptic plasticity. And movement, especially deliberate, goal-directed movement, enhances focus and primes the brain for learning. None of this is about forcing yourself through sheer effort every day. It's about setting up the conditions that allow your brain to learn that hard work is normal, even desirable. The mistake most people make is waiting to feel ready or motivated. But the brain doesn't change when you feel good. It changes when you do something difficult repeatedly in a focused state. Every time you lean into discomfort and make a disciplined choice, you activate the very circuits that will make that choice easier next time. You're not pushing against your nature, you're shaping it. Dopamine is released during effort, not just achievement. This concept rewrites how we understand motivation, and goal pursuit. For most people, motivation is seen as something that arrives before action. We wait to feel inspired before starting a difficult task, expecting a burst of energy or drive to carry us through. But this isn't how the brain actually works. The neurobiology of effort and reward tells a different story, one that reveals a powerful strategy for training discipline and long-term resilience. Dopamine is a neuromodulator, a chemical messenger that shapes motivation, focus, and the drive to pursue rewards. It's produced primarily in the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and released into various brain regions, including the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. When dopamine levels rise, we feel energized, driven, and focused on moving toward a goal. While it's true that dopamine spikes upon achieving something desirable, the most important and often overlooked fact is that dopamine is also released during the pursuit of that goal. In fact, this release during effort is what sustains us through difficulty. Effort-based dopamine signaling is one of the mechanisms that distinguishes humans from many other animals. We're wired not just to enjoy outcomes, but to derive satisfaction from the chase itself. When we set a meaningful goal and move toward it with intensity, our brain rewards us along the way. That release of dopamine acts like a fuel source, making the work feel purposeful even before we succeed. The harder the effort, the greater the potential for dopamine release, if our perception is aligned with growth and purpose. The key factor here is how the brain evaluates the meaning of effort. If you believe the work you're doing matters and that it's leading somewhere valuable, dopamine is released more consistently during that process. If you view the work as punishment or purely external pressure, that same dopamine release is blunted. The brain is not just responding to what you're doing, it's responding to how you interpret what you're doing. This is why reframing hard work as opportunity rather than obligation is a core part of building a disciplined mind. This system creates a feedback loop. The more you engage in challenging effort and interpret it positively, the more dopamine you release. That dopamine, in turn, strengthens the neural circuits that drive motivation, particularly those involving the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways. Over time, the act of working hard becomes intrinsically rewarding, independent of external outcomes. This is how people develop what's known as a growth mindset, not just psychologically, but biologically. Their brains are trained to associate effort with reward. What's particularly interesting is that this dopamine-driven reinforcement can be amplified by self-directed goals. When you set a target for yourself, rather than relying on external incentives, dopamine release is stronger and more sustained. The brain prioritizes self-generated behavior because it taps into deeper systems of autonomy and control. This means that when you choose to take on discomfort, when you willingly embrace the grind, you're activating a more potent internal reward system than if you were simply doing it for a paycheck or someone else's approval. Another important piece of this puzzle is the timing and unpredictability of dopamine release. The brain doesn't reward you at a fixed interval. It releases dopamine impulses, especially when effort is paired with unexpected progress. This element of variability can actually enhance motivation, much like it does in games or sports, where the next level or next win keeps you coming back. When applied to work, training, or learning, this randomness becomes an advantage. Small wins during difficult tasks reinforce the behavior even more strongly, training the brain to stay engaged over long time horizons. All of this shows that waiting to feel motivated before starting hard work is a flawed strategy. Instead, the act of starting and staying engaged creates the neurochemical conditions for motivation to arise. The brain can be trained to associate challenge with reward. This is a fundamental shift in how we think about motivation, discomfort, and sustained effort. Most people instinctively avoid difficulty because the brain's default mode is to conserve energy and seek comfort. But this default setting is not fixed. It's plastic. The brain is capable of adapting to new associations, and when it learns that challenge consistently leads to reward, it begins to crave challenge rather than avoid it. This process begins with a concept called associative learning. The brain links experiences with outcomes. If a particular behavior consistently leads to a positive result, the brain strengthens the neural pathways associated with that behavior. Over time, the behavior becomes more automatic and the emotional response to it becomes more positive. This is the same mechanism behind habits, both good and bad. When applied to effort, the key is to consistently pair challenge with some form of intrinsic or extrinsic reward so that the brain begins to predict a positive outcome when faced with future difficulty. The neurotransmitter dopamine plays a central role in this process. When you take on a challenge and experience a sense of progress or accomplishment, even if it's small, dopamine is released. This neurochemical reward signals to the brain that the effort was valuable. If this happens repeatedly, the brain starts to anticipate dopamine in response to effort itself. In other words, the grind becomes something the brain expects to feel good, not just once the task is complete, but during the task. This prediction builds a sense of positive anticipation around hard work, which is the essence of associating challenge with reward. This association is strengthened by deliberate attention. When you consciously notice your progress during a difficult task, whether it's hitting a small milestone in a workout, solving a tough problem, or maintaining focus while tired, you amplify the connection between effort and reward. Attention acts as a spotlight in the brain, enhancing the learning signal that tells your nervous system this moment matters. The more you recognize and highlight those wins during challenge, the more robust the association becomes. There's also a structural adaptation happening in the brain during this process. The circuitry involved in goal-directed behavior, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the basal ganglia, undergoes changes when repeatedly exposed to effortful tasks paired with positive reinforcement. These changes make it easier to engage those circuits in the future. That means the more you expose your brain to challenge and reinforce it with reward, the more automatic and even enjoyable hard work becomes. This is how elite performers, top-level athletes, and high-achieving individuals build a drive that appears almost unnatural. It's not magic. It's the result of long-term, consistent training of the brain's motivational circuitry. Importantly, this association doesn't require external rewards like praise or prizes. In fact, internal rewards, like recognizing your own growth, feeling a sense of personal mastery, or simply knowing you overcame resistance, are more powerful in the long run. Internal rewards are always available, and when you learn to generate them during effort, you become self-sustaining. You're no longer dependent on outside validation to keep going. This internalization is what ultimately rewires your brain to see discomfort not as a threat, but as a signal that growth is happening. Stress also plays a role in this adaptation. Moderate levels of stress during challenge can actually enhance neuroplasticity, especially when paired with a sense of control or purpose. If you voluntarily enter a difficult situation and you stay focused through it, your brain registers the experience differently than if you were forced into it. Voluntary challenge, even when stressful, becomes a powerful training ground for resilience and reward association. The key is repetition under the right conditions. The brain doesn't form new associations through random exposure. It needs consistency, intensity, and emotional relevance. Each time you approach a challenge with the mindset that effort equals growth, and you reflect on that growth during or after the task, you're deepening the link between challenge and reward at a neural level. Effort rewires the prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia. This is a core principle in understanding how discipline and mental toughness are formed through consistent action rather than fleeting motivation. These two regions of the brain are deeply involved in decision-making, behavioral regulation, and the transformation of conscious effort into automatic patterns. By repeatedly engaging in difficult tasks, the structure and function of these brain areas are physically altered, enabling a smoother and more reliable execution of habits and focused behavior over time. The prefrontal cortex sits at the front of the brain and is responsible for executive functions: planning, focus, impulse control, and goal-directed behavior. When you're resisting a distraction, delaying gratification, or sticking to a challenging plan, it's the prefrontal cortex that is doing the work. Initially, this kind of effort feels hard because these circuits are underdeveloped or inefficient from lack of use. Every time you force yourself to stay focused on a task, resist quitting during a workout, or work through mental fatigue, you're activating this region. With consistent activation, neural efficiency improves, meaning the same tasks that once required significant mental strain begin to require less conscious effort. The other key player is the basal ganglia, a deep brain structure involved in motor control, habit formation, and reward processing. The basal ganglia operate like a behavioral engine. Once a behavior is repeated enough times, the basal ganglia begin to take over automating that action so the prefrontal cortex no longer needs to be as involved. This shift is critical. It means that the brain starts off needing deliberate effort to complete hard tasks, but over time it shifts to automatic execution. The process of doing hard things becomes less about conscious choice and more about built-in programming. Thanks to the rewiring between these regions, effort acts as the stimulus for this neural change. When you engage in a difficult activity, especially when you do so with focus and intention, synaptic plasticity is triggered. Synaptic plasticity refers to the strengthening of connections between neurons in response to repeated activation. In both the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, effortful repetition underpins this plasticity. The more you train yourself to persist through resistance, the more the brain builds pathways that support that persistence. This relationship between effort and neural change is most effective when combined with what's known as voluntary hardship. When you choose to engage in something difficult, as opposed to being forced into it, the neuromodulators involved, particularly dopamine and norepinephrine, are more active. These chemicals not only boost focus and energy during the activity, they also mark the experience as meaningful. That signal tells the brain, this matters. Pay attention. Strengthen these connections. Over time, this process leads to a more efficient, resilient, and disciplined mental state because the brain has encoded effort as a valuable and repeatable experience. Sleep and recovery further support this process. During deep sleep, especially in slow wave and REM stages, the brain consolidates changes that occurred during the day. If you've engaged your prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia through effortful tasks, those neural changes are reinforced and stabilized during sleep. This is when rewiring becomes long-term architecture. Without recovery, these adaptations are weaker or even lost, which is why rest is not a break from the process, but a necessary part of it. Another factor that enhances this rewiring is emotional salience. If an effortful act is tied to a meaningful goal or personal identity, the learning effect is stronger. When you see yourself as someone who does hard things, and each effort aligns with that self-concept, the neural circuits responsible for discipline are more deeply engaged. The prefrontal cortex, in particular, responds to this identity alignment by increasing its control over impulsive or reactive behaviors, allowing for a more consistent performance across challenging contexts. The basal ganglia, in turn, respond by streamlining these disciplined behaviors into habits. Repetition and consistency are essential for adaptation. This principle lies at the heart of how the brain and body learn, change, and improve. It applies not only to physical skill development, but also to mental toughness, emotional regulation, and behavioral discipline. The nervous system is designed to optimize around patterns. It identifies repeated inputs, marks them as significant, and begins to allocate energy and resources toward making those actions more efficient and automatic. Without repetition, there is no signal that an action matters. Without consistency, there is no opportunity for the neural circuits to strengthen and stabilize. Every time you perform a behavior, your brain registers electrical activity in specific circuits. When that behavior is repeated regularly, those circuits begin to fire more easily. This process is called long-term potentiation, where the synapses between neurons become stronger and more responsive. The more often you practice a task, whether it's focusing through distraction, waking up early to train, or finishing deep work despite fatigue, the more readily your brain executes that task the next time. Repetition is what converts effort into ability. It's not the act of doing something once that creates change, but the deliberate act of doing it again and again under similar conditions. Consistency is what allows repetition to become meaningful. Random or sporadic exposure to a challenge may produce temporary activation in the brain, but it doesn't create stable change. The brain thrives on rhythm and predictability. It needs to see a pattern in your behavior to know where to allocate its resources. Consistent practice sends a powerful signal this behavior is important. In response, the brain begins to rewire itself to make that behavior easier, more automatic, and less stressful over time. This is how habits are formed at a neural level. The more you return to the same effort at the same time, under similar internal and external conditions, the faster your brain adapts to support that behavior. There is also a biochemical response tied to consistency. Neuromodulators like dopamine, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine are released more reliably when the brain expects effort and is prepared for it. For example, If you consistently train your focus at the same hour each day, your nervous system begins to anticipate that demand. As a result, it begins to release dopamine earlier in the process, priming your attention and motivation before you even begin the task. This anticipatory release is only possible through repeated, consistent exposure. Without that consistency, the brain doesn't know when or where to direct its energy. Adaptation, whether mental or physical, follows this same rule. Muscles grow through repeated stress followed by recovery. The brain grows through repeated challenge followed by consolidation. Each time you push into discomfort, whether cognitive or emotional, you are signaling your system to expand its capacity. But if those challenges are too infrequent or random, the adaptation doesn't take hold. The nervous system needs proof that the new behavior is part of a long-term pattern before it invests the energy to change itself at a foundational level. Furthermore, repetition builds confidence through familiarity. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel manageable simply because you've been there before. Each repetition removes some of the emotional friction. Over time, the task may still be difficult, but it's no longer foreign. That shift reduces internal resistance, which is often the greatest barrier to progress. As resistance decreases, the likelihood of taking action increases. That's the loop that consistency creates. The more you repeat a task, the easier it is to begin, the more momentum you build, and the stronger your adaptation becomes. The brain also uses consistency to filter what's important. In a world flooded with stimulation, the nervous system is forced to prioritize. It pays attention to what you pay attention to consistently. If you make the act of effort a non-negotiable part of your day, the brain responds by restructuring its networks to support that effort with greater efficiency and less friction. The nervous system rewards voluntary discomfort. This principle is central to building resilience, discipline, and long-term drive. The brain does not only respond to success or ease, it is uniquely tuned to value effort that is self-initiated and difficult. When you choose to engage in discomfort, whether physical, mental, or emotional, the neurochemical response is different than if that discomfort is imposed externally. The voluntary nature of the challenge activates systems in the brain that are deeply tied to motivation, learning, and personal meaning. When discomfort is chosen, it activates the prefrontal cortex more strongly. This area of the brain is involved in planning, decision-making, and top-down control over lower reactive systems. By choosing to enter discomfort, you engage these executive functions and increase your capacity for self-regulation. You're not just experiencing stress, you're training your brain to remain in control under pressure. That act alone is a form of neurobiological reinforcement. The prefrontal cortex strengthens its connections to other areas of the brain involved in emotion regulation and focus, such as the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex. This rewiring leads to greater composure and clarity in future high-stress situations. At the neurochemical level, voluntary discomfort triggers a different pattern of dopamine release compared to passive suffering. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation and reward, is not just released when you succeed, but also during the process of willingly engaging in hard tasks. When you voluntarily push through discomfort, your brain interprets the effort as meaningful. That meaning amplifies the dopamine signal, which reinforces the behavior and increases the likelihood you'll return to the effort again. This is one of the key distinctions in the brain's reward system. Effort that is self-directed is more neurologically rewarding than effort forced upon you. The release of norepinephrine also plays a role here. This chemical increases alertness, energy, and the ability to push through fatigue. When you choose to face something hard, norepinephrine levels rise to prepare the body and mind for focused action. Over time, the nervous system becomes more efficient at producing and regulating this response, allowing you to perform better under stress. The act of choosing discomfort doesn't just feel powerful, it makes your brain and body more capable of handling adversity. Pain perception itself changes when discomfort is voluntary. Studies show that people who willingly undergo physical stress, like cold exposure or intense exercise, report less pain and greater tolerance than those exposed to the same stress involuntarily. The choice changes the signal. The brain interprets voluntary discomfort as a signal of growth rather than threat. That shift reduces the activation of stress-related circuits like the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and increases activity in circuits related to learning and plasticity. This means the experience of discomfort, when self-chosen, becomes a training ground for resilience and adaptation. Voluntary discomfort also activates what's called the salience network, which helps the brain determine what matters most in a given moment. When you willingly enter a state of difficulty, your brain tags that experience as highly relevant. That tagging increases memory consolidation, emotional association, and learning potential. In simple terms, when you choose to suffer for something, the brain remembers it, it assigns it value, it grows from it. The more frequently you choose discomfort, the more normalized it becomes in your system. The nervous system stops interpreting it as an emergency and starts seeing it as familiar territory. That shift reduces fear, increases readiness, and builds momentum. It also allows for a shift in identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who does hard things, which feeds back into motivation, effort, and consistency. The nervous system learns to anticipate reward on the other side of struggle, not in spite of the struggle, but because of it. That anticipation shifts your entire relationship with work, pain, and effort. Focus shifts from outcome to process. This shift is fundamental to sustaining motivation over the long term and developing a resilient mindset. When motivation depends solely on achieving a specific result, whether it's winning a competition, hitting a sales target, or reaching a fitness goal, it becomes fragile. External outcomes are often outside of your full control and can be influenced by luck, timing, or other people's actions. This fragility can cause motivation to fluctuate wildly, leaving you vulnerable to disappointment and burnout. In contrast, focusing on the process means placing your attention on the behaviors, habits, and daily actions that contribute to progress. The process is something you can control directly. When you anchor your motivation in the effort itself rather than the outcome, you create a sustainable source of drive that doesn't depend on external validation. This mindset is supported by brain systems involved in attention, learning, and reward. Neuroscience reveals that the brain's dopamine system is activated not just by rewards, but also by cues predicting those rewards. When you focus on the process, you create frequent opportunities for these predictive cues. For example, the act of preparing for a task, completing a set of exercises, or studying for a session can trigger dopamine release. This release encourages repetition and keeps the brain engaged with the activity itself. The pleasure comes from the journey, not just the destination. Additionally, focusing on process helps reduce anxiety and stress that often accompany outcome-based thinking. When all energy is invested in a future event or goal, the brain's threat detection systems, such as the amygdala, can become overactive. This overactivation can impair cognitive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation. By redirecting attention to the immediate steps you can take, you calm the nervous system and enhance your ability to perform in the moment. The prefrontal cortex plays a critical role in maintaining process-oriented focus. This region is responsible for executive control, allowing you to plan, sustain attention, and inhibit distractions. By training your mind to stay with the process, you strengthen the prefrontal cortex's capacity. Over time, this results in improved self-regulation and the ability to persist through challenges without becoming overwhelmed by pressure to achieve a specific outcome. Another benefit of process focus is that it promotes a growth mindset. When your attention is on learning, improvement, and mastery of skills, setbacks become opportunities rather than failures. The brain's plasticity mechanisms are engaged more effectively because the feedback you receive is framed in terms of effort and adaptation, not fixed results. This framing encourages experimentation and resilience, which are key to long-term success. Moreover, focusing on the process allows for the development of intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation arises from the inherent satisfaction of engaging in an activity rather than external reward.